two people can see the exact same world and get the exact same information and still make completely different perceptual decisions. And today we're going to start explaining why, and why one of them might look perfect on a test while actually perceiving absolutely nothing at all. And signal detection theory is that tool that's going to let us separate what you can perceive from how you choose to respond. So that is on the schedule for today. But before we get there, we do have some business to finish in terms of perception. So before we move on to signal detection theory, I want to do the thing that I promised, which was test a challenge about the fusiform face area, whether it is for expertise or whether it is specifically for faces. So just a brief recap. Last time when we met, we were looking at how activation in that fusiform face area, that region of your brain in your temporal lobe, there was evidence from Gautier et al. That it actually increases with expertise in recognizing novel objects. And those novel objects were called Greebles. And subjects would get tested on identifying Greebles from various families and of various genders. And it's important to note it was not just these 10 Greebles. They had hundreds that were created using specific rules about what a certain family looks like and what a certain gender looks like. And then those were just combined to create hundreds upon hundreds of individual looking Greebles. And what they found was that before training, so they're on the left, the Greebles did not activate the fusiform face area. So that blue bar is the Greeble activation of that specific area of the brain. No activation before training, but then after training, once these subjects became experts on these made-up stimuli, then all of a sudden the fusiform face area lit up when they were looking at Greebles. So this was taken as very strong evidence that your fusiform face area does respond to faces, but that in reality, what it's responding to is other complex, highly trained stimuli. So it's not just a specific face area, it is a highly complex, highly trained stimulus area. So faces fall into that category, but Greebles fall into that category for the subjects that were trained on Greebles, and cars fall into that category for car experts, and their fusiform face area lights up when they see cars, and birds fall into that category for bird experts, and bird expert fusiform face area lights up when they're looking at birds. And one of the challenges that we left you with was the idea that some Greebles actually look like faces. So if you recall, we took a look at this Greeble here, and you might not see it initially, but if you put just maybe one more distinguishing feature on this Greeble, such as eyes, then all of a sudden you can see that it has a lot of features that we associate with a face, with a head, and perhaps it is those features that are activating the fusiform face area. So the claim last time was that the fusiform face area might just be for expertise, but not for faces. So let's see what sort of speculations we came up with. Let's see what sort of theories we came up with to explain why this might occur and what the implications of that might be. So any thoughts on what might actually be going down here? Yep.
I think it is just a highly specialized area because even though Greebles look like faces, cars don't look like faces. I mean, looking at the front, but no, being a car expert means you know a lot about the inside of a car.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot more working parts than just eyes, nose, face, and the settings of them. And I don't know if the faces response for the FFA went down for car experts from what it was before they were.
Whoops. So you're talking about, okay, yeah, I have the I was looking at the wrong one. So you're talking about the fact that the orange bar on the right is lower in the study? Yep, okay.
But we haven't seen that for the bird experts or car experts, so we don't know if faces.
Okay.
To make up for the cars and birds.
Well, these aren't actually lowered response times. This is lowered strength or lowered amount of activation in that fusiform face area. So the idea is that the car experts, you singled out the car experts, they activate that fusiform face area, but cars do not look like faces. And there's a lot more to identifying a car than there is to identifying a face. A lot more parts, a lot more, you got to look at it from the front, from the back, and all those sorts of things. So you would take as the strongest evidence that the car experts are the ones that really kind of push the idea that no, this is for highly trained stimuli and not just for faces. Okay, does anybody want to? Yep.
I think you could just argue either way, because on one hand, it wouldn't matter if it looks like a face, because before training, the strength of the response was low anyway. But you could also argue the more you look at the Greebles, the more you might relate them to a face in order to associate them with the family and gender.
Okay, so the idea is that there's kind of two things that you mentioned that I think the first one, if I'm paraphrasing this correctly, if you take a look at on the left slide there, before training, the Greebles did activate the fusiform face area somewhat. So were you saying that there might be facial features that they just weren't sort of aware of?
I'm more saying that it wouldn't matter that they look like a face, because it hardly activated the fusiform face area before they had become experts at it. So that would be like an argument that it doesn't matter that they're face.
Oh, okay. So it was kind of the opposite of what I said. So you're saying that they do kind of look like faces, but because they didn't activate it at the beginning, we can discount the idea that the face likeness of the Greebles is actually what's causing the fusiform face area activation. All right, very cool. Very good idea. So yeah, so does anybody else have any kind of speculations on what might be going here? So we have basically two lines of evidence and two arguments that the fusiform face area actually is for faces. No, it is, shoot, one for highly trained, because cars don't look like faces. And then your argument, I kind of got it twisted. Your argument is that it is for faces. It's not for faces.
I had two separate arguments.
Yeah, two separate.
Faces and one against faces.
Okay, so I was half right that one of you. So this is actually a really really interesting kind of exercise here, because you can see how we're looking at the same stuff, right? We're looking at the same Greebles, we're looking at the same results, we're looking at the same kind of setups, and you can have very strong arguments going one way that no, this is just for faces, and then still make very strong arguments going the other way that no, this is actually just highly trained stimuli. So it's very important to remember that when you have these theories, it's very rare that you get a definitive answer like, oh no, it's got to be on this side, and there's absolutely no way to predict that it would go the other way. However, whenever you come to a crossroads like that, where you say, well, based on what these Greebles did, some of them look like faces, some of them don't look like faces, so maybe that's why they were able to become experts at them, and that's why the fusiform face area lights up. Whenever you have two predictions that go in opposite directions, you always have yourself your next experiment. And that experiment is to test which one of those two different explanations is actually the case. So if you were thinking that, well, the car experts kind of show that things that don't look like faces can actually activate the fusiform face area, and complex stimuli that require more than just a couple of parts actually activate the fusiform face area, well, then that would, for example, give you a prediction that you should find other experts, because there are tons of experts out there. We just talked about car experts. We just talked about bird experts. But what about, so I'm trying to think of something that you'll see why I'm struggling a little bit here, that doesn't look at all like faces, What about somebody like a shoe expert, right? What about like a sneakerhead that can identify, the year and the make of Air Jordans or whatever, Nike drop was out there, right? Do they activate that fusiform face area? And if they did, then we have more evidence that, this is not face-like at all, and it's still activating the fusiform face area. But then if they didn't, but they're still experts, they're still able to identify all these stimuli, then you have strong evidence that no, it actually is for faces. And a corollary of that prediction would be there has to be something face-like in cars that is activating that fusiform face area. So on that note, some of the challenges that have been raised in some of these studies and some of these conclusions is if you take a look at the car experts, one of the things that many people have pointed out is that a lot of times cars actually look like they have faces. So one of the studies that the lab where I did a postdoc in did on facial perception was sort of what is the minimum stimulus for a face. So they just made random white noise kind of stimuli that were symmetrical. And if you have something that's symmetrical and it's got two random dark areas above one random dark area and it's symmetrical around those two, your mind will start to see a face. And right here we have a very nice example. If you don't see it, there are the two eyes. There's your nose. There's your mouth right there. And if we remove the car, there's your face right there. So it could be that what is actually going on with the car experts is that even though there are multiple different areas of the car that can activate, that you need in order to identify a car, the front of a car for many cars is that thing that will identify it. What does the headlights look like? What does the grille look like? And if you can see the faceness in those, maybe that's why the fusiform face area gets activated. And maybe that's why car experts become car experts, because they're able to basically hijack this area that is just for faces by seeing faces in cars. And that's why all of a sudden they become car experts. So one of the things that you can kind of play this game to sort of convince yourself, if you're not believing it yet, that these are actually, or kind of look like faces, is you can actually sort of spot the emotion in a car. So this car kind of looks a little bit happy, it looks a little bit chill. This car does not. This car looks worried. It looks a little bit anxious. It does not want to be driven. And you might think that some cars don't fall into this pattern of like the two headlights and the grille in front. And you're right about that. But as we're going to see, oftentimes there are things that look like faces everywhere in our environment. So in this car in particular, it's not immediately obvious, but if you zoom in and enhance and zoom in a little bit more, you can see two eyes, an open mouth, teeth. And there was actually a Reddit post once where there was just this massive collection of cars with different facial features, associated with the car. So if that is the case, then you have again the possibility that maybe these car experts are relying on the fusiform face area because they're seeing faces in cars. Maybe they're not aware of it, but they're somehow putting these stimuli together in order to form faces, which is then able to hijack that specialized area of their brain, and that's what allows them to become car experts. And again, this alternative explanation, as cognitive psychologists, one of the things that we would want to do is we would want to say, well, let's, how could we possibly test this? What might be a way to get to the bottom of this? And you'll notice, for example, every example of a car with a face has been the front of the car. Can car experts identify cars just from the back? And if they're identifying cars from the back, does that activate their fusiform face area? If it did, then complex stimuli, more evidence for that. If it didn't, then specialized facial features, fusiform face area, more evidence for that. So the car expert one was the one that was brought up as the sort of critical defining case. And I think that's because I was the least convinced when I read about the bird experts, because I don't know, like, to me, birds have faces, right? I mean, that bird has a face, and that bird looks annoyed, that you took a picture. And this one kind of also looks annoyed with a little bit of malice mixed in, and this one here looks surprised, and this one here looks shocked, right? And these birds have faces. So if you're a bird expert, it's not surprising that the fusiform face area would get activated when things are very face-like. And we're going to go to one more big example of what kind of makes a lot of this very, very kind of difficult to tease out. You might wonder, well, why are there hundreds of experiments on this fusiform face area, and whether it's specialized or whether it's for faces? But before we get to that reason, just one more kind of little thing to point out. This idea of hijacking the fusiform face area and the idea of experience-dependent plasticity, the idea that because of your experience with stimuli, you can actually hijack portions of your brain that were not originally activated during those tasks, but are now activated during those tasks. You can actually change the rewiring of your brain. This is something that I don't want to gloss over in terms of just how magical this is for our existence. And there was a science fiction story, and it's here in, again, this Reddit post, what is that book? And it says, a sci-fi story, short story, 80s or before, surgeon modifies blind girlfriend's brain so she can use the plentiful vision synapses to think. This makes her a super genius. So it's a science fiction story about a surgeon, and he had a girlfriend, and she was blind, but there was nothing wrong with her visual cortex. It was just her sensory, eyes, her rods and cones, or her eyes just didn't operate properly. So he found a procedure that basically allowed for the plasticity of her visual cortex to be mapped onto higher reasoning processes like her frontal cortex. And then all of a sudden, she becomes a super genius. And then the implications of that for the world that they live in is just, it's a really well-written story. And I will say that I am going to put out a call to any of you or anybody watching this online. If you know the name of that story, please let me know, because this was a Reddit post that was done a year ago. And this is me coming there for the answer and finding out that the person was searching for what I was searching for, and nobody has found it. I know it exists. I don't think we're sharing a false memory here, but I would love to read that book or that story one more time. So if anybody knows it, let me know. But again, this is science fiction, right? That ability to harness the visual cortex for things other than vision. But fusiform face area seems to be able to be to have the same thing done to it if you become an expert in some other identification. All right, and then the last challenge, and again, the thing that makes this very, very difficult to really kind of tease out, and why we have so many multiple experiments for it, is other complex stimuli in general oftentimes have what is known as pareidolia. And pareidolia is the phenomenon where humans will see meaningful patterns in non-meaningful stimuli. So this is actually something we're gonna touch on in signal detection. But just for our for our purposes here, we will oftentimes perceive things as being meaningful even when they don't have that meaning in the actual stimulus. And one of the places that occurs very often is in faces. So we've already seen it in cars, but it happens over and over and over again. So we'll go through a few examples. It happens in candle holders. These candles look mortified to have candles placed into them, right? It happens in those binoculars at tourist attractions. It happens in anxious looking sinks and faucets. It happens in very happy looking chairs that are just waiting for you to sit down. This is one that I remember seeing over and over again, and you've seen it over and over again. This always looked like a face to me. It just, like every wall I would look at that had this, it looked like somebody staring back at me, just worried. And this happens so often, and the fact that these photos exist shows you just how easy it is for people to see faces and notice them and catch them when they're there. So for example, this one here, I absolutely love. This is reflections in a pot. And I'll zoom in on that one there in case you didn't see the face. Made because of the certain angle of the pot and the burners and where it was placed on this stove, you know, and right there, it just triggers. Your Fusiform face area is probably lighting up right now. So again, just example after example, a box that's having a hard time and needs a little helping hand. An embarrassed USB clip, you know, more shocked outlets because one of them has been plugged into the matrix. And again, it's just everywhere. This is a shadow of leaves on a garage door. And if you can't see the face yet, there's one eye, there's the nose, there's the top lip, there's the bottom lip, there's your face. So it literally happens everywhere. And I have this one, this last example got burned into my brain years ago, but it's not here yet. I just want to give a little bit of context. So the guy without the shirt, that's Iggy Pop. He is a singer-songwriter. He was lead singer for the Stooges, was the big group that he was with. That guy in the upper right playing keyboards, that's actually David Bowie. The two of them were very good friends. Iggy Pop loves to perform with his shirt off. And when you talk about seeing faces everywhere, this is probably going to be the one that gets burned into your memory too. There's Iggy Pop on the left, and then Sad Torso is sad on the right. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But those faces can occur anywhere. And we see it, even though there's no face there in the torso, we still perceive that as being, you know, in the configuration of a face. So the challenges are just abundant to try to tease this area out. And it's an important thing to tease out because it basically gives you that ability to determine, for example, whether faces really are highly specialized, important stimuli that we have evolved dedicated areas of our brain to, or are they just highly trained stimuli and we've evolved a part of our brain for highly trained stimuli. They have different implications for what that actually means for our behavior. But just to kind of put a cap in this, and this is some speculations that I had. If you were going to show that the fusiform face area was for faces only, then you would need to show that it responds to faces. So that's been done, right? It's the evidence that it responds to faces is very, very strong. But you would also want to show that it does not respond to highly trained stimuli. So if you can come up with some sort of untrained face and show that there's a lower response in the fusiform face area, like you're not an expert at this face, and therefore there's a lowered response in the fusiform face area, then that would be an indication that it's not just for faces, it's actually some sort of highly trained stimuli. So if those untrained faces still lit up the fusiform face area, faces. If those untrained faces did not light up the fusiform face area, then it's for highly trained stimuli. And the only thing that I could think of, the only phenomenon that might do this is the interracial identification phenomenon, where people are about 10% less accurate when identifying individuals outside of their race versus individuals inside of their race. So if you were able to find people, a group that was terrible at identifying some other ethnicity or some other race, and their fusiform face area did not light up when they were looking at these individuals' faces, that would be very strong evidence that it actually is for highly trained stimuli and not faces. And then you would also need to show that it does not respond to trained complex objects that lack faceness, like, for example, shoes from the shoe expert. And then if you wanted to show that it was for complex stimuli, you basically need to do the opposite. You need to show that it responds to highly trained complex stimuli that lack faceness. So you would want to go back, redesign the Greebles study so that they're not symmetric, so that they don't have hair, they don't have noses, there's nothing face-like about them. And as we saw with the Pareidolia examples, that sometimes is a lot harder than it looks. All right, so any final questions, comments on the fusiform face area and faces? Are they special or trained before we go on to our next? You did?
Yeah.
What is it?
It's from None So Blind by Joe Haldeman. It's in a collection of 15 short stories.
It's called None So Blind?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, thank you. It's called None So Blind. I'm going to respond to that Reddit post. Joel Haldeman? Okay, I'm just going to leave a note for myself. None So Blind, Joe Haldeman. Thank you. Awesome. And if you don't mind me saying, what did you use to find that? You just really? Oh my God.
I Googled it, found the Reddit post, I went a little bit more down, saw someone asking it somewhere else, someone responding, and I was like, well, I gotta check to make sure it's right. So I went on archive.org, looked
Okay.
up the book, borrowed it, I didn't have to make an account, that's fine. And then I read it, key term searched
Yeah.
for blind, found a bunch of passages, clicked on one and saw kind of what the synopsis was saying.
I can't believe that worked. Thank you so much. That is amazing. That is, I would, you know what? I will just say this. A lot of those skills are exactly what you need to do great things in psychology. But I will take that win right now because a lot of those skills are exactly what I needed to find that story. I will be reading that tonight. All right. Thank you so much. So mystery solved. I think this is the perfect time to go to the next one. So up until now, we've been talking a lot about how things are represented, representations for perception, how your mind builds that sensory experience from the input, maybe from some top-down processing. But now we're going to switch the lenses and we're going to ask a different question. And the question is that when that input is ambiguous, how do you decide, for example, if you're looking at a face versus you're looking not at a face? And what does it cost you if you're wrong? And what if the input is always ambiguous? Well, that is what we're going to turn to now with signal detection. So signal detection is a very important tool that we can use to try to understand the human mind. So I like this representation of the human mind as extending beyond our physical body. That is a view of the embedded and embodied human mind, or this would actually be embedded human mind. So always remember that, always kind of throw one of these up just to remind us that it's not just our brain, it's actually the entire system that we use for doing cognitive work. And sometimes the cognitive work that we do is just detecting things, just searching for things. So you're in a library and you want to find the right book. You're looking for a short story about a blind woman that gets surgery so she can access her visual cortex. These are things that we do cognitively, and visual search is just something that can be quite simple, and then it can also be quite complex. So theoretically, cognitively, it's quite complex. But sometimes it feels simple, and we have to have situations like this where you're looking for Waldo to kind of realize just how difficult it can be and just how magical it is to be able to take a look at the world and find the thing that you're looking for. Is again something that seems very trivial, but hopefully we're starting to see that the more trivial something feels, oftentimes the more difficult it actually is. All right, so let's talk about some signal detection. Let's set it up with two stories about two different individuals. So we have the individual on the left there, and the individual on the left there seems to not be able to hear anything, right? She's trying to hear something on her phone, nothing is working. So let's just say that her auditory system is compromised to the point where she can't hear things. And then we have the person on the right there, and she is clearly hypersensitive to tones. Her earphones are way, way too loud. And let's say that we took these two people. Person on the left can't hear a thing. Person on the right, super sensitive hearing. And we gave them a hearing test. So we're going to give them a hearing test. And what we do is we're going to give them a whole bunch of trials, and we're going to play a tone, or we're not going to play a tone. And the person is going to have to indicate whether they heard a tone in that trial or they didn't hear a tone. So this is kind of a typical setup. You put on a light to indicate that the trial is active. And then when the light goes off, you just ask them, hey, did you hear a tone or did you not hear a tone? And they try to be as accurate as they can. So we have trial one. Let's say that we actually play the tone, and this individual with the hypersensitive hearing, they go, yes, I heard a tone. So they got that correct. Trial two, there's no tone. So they say no. Trial three, there's no tone. So they say nope. Trial four, there's a tone. They say yes. So they detected that tone. Trial five, there's a tone. They say yeah. So they detected that tone. Trial six, there's a tone. They say yep. So they detected that tone. Trial seven, no tone. They say no. And then trial eight, there's a tone, and they say yes. So they get a check mark there. And in terms of detecting the tone when the tone is present, this person scored 100%. They got it every single time. Super sensitive hearing, notice a tone every single time. All right, now what about our other individual with no ability to hear? And we put them in the hearing test. And we do trial number one, and we play a tone. And the person says, no, didn't hear anything. Well, that's a mistake. They got that wrong. Trial two, there's no tone. They say, nope, didn't hear anything. Trial three, there's no tone. And they say, nada. Trial four, there's a tone. They say, nay. Got that one wrong. Trial five, there's a tone. They say, nah. Got that wrong. If you're wondering if I consulted an online thesaurus for ways of saying no, you'd be correct. All right, trial six, there's a tone. They say not. They get that one wrong. Trial seven, no tone. They say negative. And then trial eight, no, there is a tone. And they say no. They get that one wrong. And they detected a tone 0% of the time. So at this point, we have the two individuals, and we have the one that detects the tone 0% of the time that the tone is present. We have the other one that detects the tone 100% of the time that the tone is present. So it's pretty clear that the one individual has way better hearing than the other individual. So is that making sense so far? Okay. So let's say that we go back to this person with the hearing test, and we say, look, we're going to give you another hearing test. And this time we want you to really try, right? You completely failed that first hearing test. This time we want you to really try to, to see if you can hear the tone. The person says, all right, I'm going to really, really try this time. And you go through the test, and lo and behold, they detect every single tone. Every single time that there was a tone, they say, yes. Yes, I hear that tone. Yes, I hear that tone. And in this case, they detected tone 100%. So 100% of the time, when the tone was there, they said yes. In this case, what do you think might account for the fact that this person is now detecting tones at 100%? Any speculations about what might be going on? I'll give you a hint. Their hearing did not improve. Mm-hmm.
They were looking for other things that happened when the signal happened.
So they might have been looking for other things that happened when the tone happened, such as maybe feeling vibrations in the headphones. So that's a possibility. They circumvented the actual hearing test. So now they're not detecting hearing, they're detecting touch and vibration. So that's one possibility. Any other possibilities? There is at least one other one. Put a pin in it. Well, yep.
Maybe they were watching the person doing the test like tap every time that they would like make the sound over.
So the person doing the test or administering the test, they actually had to tell in terms of when the tone was being presented. Okay, yeah, that's another possibility that would lead to this newly improved performance without any actual improvement in hearing. So again, this is something that we are going to bring up again. But the fact that you could take a look at vibrations, you could take a look at the tells that the individual has, that the administrator of the test has. All of these things might allow them to pick up the fact that when there's a tone, when there is a tone and they're not actually hearing it, but they're responding. All right, so let's dive in a little bit deeper. Let's take a look at this individual here. And one of the things that we didn't mention, we didn't bring to light, was what happened in the no tone situations. So we just indicated that they detect the tone 100% of the time. But what happens in the no tone scenario with this particular individual? Well, when they did trial number 2, they successfully identified that there was no tone. And when they did trial number 3, they successfully identified that there was no tone. And when they did trial number 7, they successfully identified that there was no tone. But this other individual, what accounted for their improved detection of tones was that every single trial, they now just said yes. They just said, yep, I hear it. So trial 1, the tone was played, and they said, yeah, light went on. Sure, I heard a tone. And then when trial 2 came up and there was no tone, they basically said, yeah, no, I hear a tone there as well. So now they're getting the no tone trials completely incorrect. So trial 3, they say that there's a tone when there's no tone. Trial 7, they said there was a tone when there was no tone. So they successfully detected the tones 100% of the time, but they also successfully said that unsuccessfully said that there was no tones when there actually was a tone. So this is the kind of situations, these are extreme examples, but this is the kind of situation that signal detection theory was made to identify and distinguish between and get to the heart of what it is that we can actually detect. Because what was it that changed with that person on the left? Mm-hmm. Their answer. So their answers changed from being honest to just saying that they hear a tone every single time. So another way of saying that is that their strategy changed. So because of whatever decisions they were making, they decided that it is more important to identify when the tone is there than to be mistaken when the tone is absent. And that led to a strategy shift that led to them detecting the tones now at 100%, but importantly, did not at all change their ability to actually hear or detect these tones. So those are the kind of things that we need to tease out. And that's what signal detection as an approach is made to do. So signal detection, this is a procedure. It's a method that is used to measure the sensitivity of a perceptual system. And if you want to understand perceptual systems, how we perceive things, sight, touch, taste, one of the first things you need to know is what can we see? What can we taste? What can we touch? And some of the earliest experiments in perception in general go back to what is the minimum stimulus that you need to detect something? How sensitive are you to detect whether something's there or to detect differences? And that is, again, the idea of sensitivity of a perceptual system. So this ability of an organism to detect or respond to external stimuli is what sensitivity is. And in signal detection, it is measured by a number called D prime. And D prime is called, when you see it, don't call it D prime. I tell my stats students this all the time. Anytime you see a symbol, train your mind to call it what it actually stands for rather than calling it as its symbol. Because if you train yourself that every time you see that D prime, it's sensitivity. And when you see D prime, you say sensitivity and you think sensitivity, well, that signals a whole bunch of concepts in your mind that you can then draw upon, whereas D prime almost means nothing. So that's a little hack that I always tell my students in stats. Good hack wherever you go. Call things not by the name of the term, not by the symbols in the term. But anyways, I'm getting off track here. Sensitivity, that is defined as a number that is the distance between the signal distribution and the noise distribution using a signal detection paradigm. And we are going to have to unpack what those two are, because we know the term signal, we know the term noise, but in signal detection theory, they refer to very, very specific things. So my absolute favorite example of signal and noise distributions comes from John Cage. So John Cage, he was an American composer and music theorist, and this is him in his later years. And he was just fascinated with basically like what is music? If you break it down to its basic components, what is music? And his most famous piece is called 433. And it is one of the few pieces that I can actually play on the piano. But we're not going to subject you to that. But I will show you a professional pianist playing his piece 433.
And now, a performance of John Cage's 433. Please welcome our soloist, William Marks.
All right, so that's actually me fast forwarding this because that's a little more annoying than I thought it was going to be. It's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. And not only can I play this on piano, I can play this on any instrument, but that's what it is. It's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of just silence. And John Cage was fascinated with silence. And he did this. It was a very good reason why he did this. I can't remember the name of the artist, but he went to a art gallery and saw these paintings on the wall. And the paintings were just white. They were just white paint on a canvas, completely white, and put up on the wall. And he asked the artist, you know, what's going on here? Why are these all blank? And the artist told him that the reason they're blank is because that brings into focus what the viewer themselves brings to the art. So the shadows that fall on the art, the way that it's hung in the space, without any distracting information in the actual piece itself, you can bring to focus what the observer themselves actually brings to it. And John Cage, when he learned that, he was like, I've got to do this with my expertise, which is music. So he made a piece that was completely silent. But as you would notice, other than my ill-advised fast-forwarding noises, it's never silent. This piece has never been properly performed because the musician always makes noises, the audience always makes noises. There's always noise going around. And that's one of the things that John Cage, when he was thinking about silence and being silent, one of the things that he realized very quickly is that you are never in a place that is silent. So even if I stop talking now, you can hear other people in the hallway. You can hear shuffling of papers, moving on your seat. If we had the lights on, you could hear the fluorescent lights. You are never in a place where you don't have some sound. And John Cage actually really wanted to experience silence once. So he learned of an anechoic chamber that had been built. And this is from his book called Silence. So he visited an anechoic chamber at Harvard University. This is a special room that was made so that no sound could penetrate that room. It was insulated. It had whatever reflective surfaces would just swallow up sound. It was a place that you could go to and there would be absolutely no sound stimulus whatsoever. So he was very excited. John Cage was just very excited. He was thinking to himself, oh my gosh, first time in my life, I'm going to hear silence. So he goes in there and he was extremely disappointed. And as he mentions, he goes, I heard two sounds, one high, one low. When I described them to the engineer in charge, he informed me the high one was my nervous system in operation. The low one was my blood in circulation. So they took away all outside sound, and yet still there was noise in the system. There was literally the high-pitched sound from just the random firings of his nervous system, and there was the lower-pitched sound of just the blood circulating through his body. So that is a nice example of what the noise distribution is. It is the noise that is present in the system. It is everything, you can think of it as everything present other than what you're looking for, everything present other than the signal. And that idea of noise, that idea of ever-present not signal is one of the components of signal detection. So we talk about a noise distribution. So what is the noise distribution? Well, the noise distribution is the noise in the system or the activation in the system when no signal is present. So I'll kind of give you a concrete example here. So let's say that you're a teacher and you're teaching an elementary school class and you want your children to put up their hands if they have a question or if they want to give an answer, right? Part of your job as a teacher then is to identify who is putting up their hand and who is not putting up their hand. So in this case, what you're looking for is you're looking for signal. You're looking for that hand up in the air, indicating that this child wants to get called on, they have something to say. What might be noise in that particular situation? What might be something that looks like a raised hand when the child does not want to get called on? Mm-hmm. Someone stretching. So movement of students, especially somebody stretching like that girl right in the middle there where the two hands are coming up, that's your noise in the system. So the teacher is looking for signal. She's looking for a hand up. But maybe a student is, trying to stretch and they don't want to get called on, but that is noise in the system. Or maybe a student is, trying to reach back to her backpack and get something out of her bag. That's noise in the system. So there's always going to be this idea of noise when you're looking for a particular piece of evidence for a particular signal. So let's kind of, before we go on to some more kind of like technical stuff, let's make sure, absolutely sure that we're using noise correctly. So one of the things that is unfortunate about the name of noise is that it has a lot of other connotations, especially in the English language, such as, the environment is just loud, like, oh my gosh, this room is so noisy. But noise is any kind of variability that looks like evidence, even when a signal is not there. So can anybody think of things in your environment or just things in any sort of perceptual system that would be noise in a perception task? Make sure that we get this down. Yep. So if you're doing any sort of auditory detection, cars passing by would be an example of noise. So we'll kind of group that into environmental noise, external stimuli, not for the thing that you're looking for, but still adding noise to the system. So there's external noise. Any other types of noise that we can think of? What kind of noise did John Cage experience? What was the high-pitched noise? What was that? It was his nervous system. So you have internal noise that actually comes from your sensory system. So if you've ever closed your eyes and then pressed on them a little bit and saw those flashing lights, that's noise. There are no flashing lights, right? But that's your sensory system actually having an experience when there's no signal present. And you'll hear people talk about things that are with the language of noise. So for example, if you have a headache, it's a pounding headache, it's a thumping headache. It actually, you can kind of, if you've ever had a really bad headache, you can hear your heartbeat in your ears sometimes. So again, that's that idea of internal noise. And then sometimes you have things like cognitive noise. Like you have previous expectations that are leading you to see things that actually aren't there, right? Those kinds of cognitive expectations, where your attention is. Did something pull your attention somewhere else, and now you don't have, the ability to process stuff? All of that can also be considered to be noise. So it's anything that can activate your system, but is not signal. It's not what you're looking for. That is in general what we say about noise. So why is this important? Why is this idea of noise something that we need to make sure that we completely understand? Well, it has to do with evidence. So here on the x-axis here, we're going to plot some stuff. Here on the x-axis here, we have evidence. Evidence that the signal is there. Evidence that what you're looking for is actually present. And it goes from low evidence on the left all the way to really high evidence on the right. So if you think about it in terms of that child raising their hand in class, sometimes a kid will be like this if they're really shy, right? That's kind of low evidence that your hand is up. Sometimes the kid is like, oh, and they got to support it with the other hand because they're, that's really high evidence, right? So sometimes you get low evidence, sometimes you get high evidence. And that sometimes varies depending upon how much evidence there are. So there's the frequency of impression, basically the frequency with which you get a certain amount of evidence. So let's take a look at the noise distribution first. And noise distributions, they are theorized, and there's good evidence that this is the case, they're theorized as basically being a normal curve, a bell curve. And what this means is that when there is absolutely no signal, when there is nothing there to detect, sometimes you have very high evidence. We're going to use little smiley faces for those instances. Sometimes you have very high evidence that there's actually a signal when there's no signal. So that would be an example of the kid that's in class and they're stretching, right? And their hand goes all the way up, and that doesn't happen very often. That's why the line is so low. The frequency is not high, so we got a low line indicating the frequency. But sometimes there's a lot of evidence, even when there's no signal. And then other times, there's very low evidence when there's no signal, and we're talking extremely low evidence. So this would be a case in that classroom where every kid is sitting still and their hands are down and they just sit there. That doesn't happen very often, right? Oftentimes you get very, very low evidence. But most of the time, you will have a certain amount of evidence, And the height of the line there indicates how often that evidence occurs. So if that little smiley face is one instance of evidence, you can imagine that that amount of evidence where that center smiley face is, that happens very often. So you can think of this line as little pieces of evidence stacked on little pieces of evidence. You get this evidence way more, or this level of evidence way more, when the signal is not there. And when you take a look at how much evidence there is across all of these instances, what you get is you get this nice little normal distribution of evidence where, importantly, this whole discussion, no signal. When there's no signal, sometimes you get very little evidence, sometimes you get a lot of evidence, but most of the time you kind of get that middle amount of evidence. Okay, everybody clear on the idea of evidence being there, but no signal being there? All right, so one of the important things to remember is that that noise is always there. Whether the signal is there or the signal is not there, the noise is always there. The children will always be moving somewhat. The nervous system will always be activated. Your blood, hopefully, will always be circulating. There is always going to be noise in the system. So we never talk about just a signal distribution. What we talk about is the signal plus noise distribution. And the idea is that the signal comes in and it has a certain amount of evidence. And that evidence gets added to the noise. And what that does is it moves the entire distribution to the right. So you can think to the point where there's more evidence now. So the signal added evidence. So now there's more evidence, but it's added evidence to the noise, right? So we still have that noise, and you can basically think of that's the distribution of how often certain amounts of noise occurs, and that's the level of evidence and the frequency with which that occurs when there's no signal. When there is a signal, you take that exact same noise distribution and you just add signal to it and you just move it over so that we got evidence over here. And that's where that signal plus noise distribution comes. So now we have the two distributions. Get rid of the smiley faces for now. We have the two distributions, the amount of evidence that occurs and how often it occurs with just noise being there, that's the noise distribution. The amount of evidence that occurs and how often it occurs when the signal is there and it's added to the noise, that's the signal plus noise distribution. And not to get too technical, but there's a way to measure the distance between the two peaks, and that is your measure of sensitivity. So that is how we measure sensitivity. And the last piece of this, and this is where signal detection really made its contribution, is that when you're making a decision as to whether or not something is there or something is not there, what you do is you drop a criterion line at some point of evidence. And in your mind, you tell yourself, anything that occurs beyond that line, above that line, whenever there is evidence that is above that line, I am going to say yes. Something is there. I'm going to say yes, I detected that signal. Yes, I perceived something. And if anything occurs that causes evidence that is below that criterion line, that's where you say no. No, I didn't see anything. No, I didn't, I didn't detect anything. So any evidence for that teacher that falls above that criterion line in terms of how much hands are moving, she's going to call on that student. She's going to say, yes, Jason, you have a question? Anything below that line, she's not going to call on the student. She's going to go on to something else. So with that setup, what we have here is we have 4 distinct possibilities in terms of what occurs in any sort of signal detection paradigm, in any sort of decision where you're trying to determine yes or no. So let's take a look at that noise distribution first and take a look at what this criterion splits that noise distribution into. So once again, noise distribution, no signal. In this area here, this is the part of the noise distribution where there is nothing there and it falls below your criteria. So you say, there's nothing there. And that is known as a correct rejection. Nothing is there. You get it right. You say nothing is there. That's a correct rejection. But notice that we got that little section of noise that falls to the right of the criteria. And that is when you say, yes, I detected something, and it's actually not there. And that is a false alarm. That is when you call on that student and you say, oh yeah, Johnny, you have something to say? And Johnny's like, I don't, my hand wasn't up. That's when the evidence crossed over past that criterion, but it actually wasn't any signal. That's known as a false alarm. So those are the two things that can occur when there's no signal, correct rejection or false alarms. What about when there is a signal? Well, when there is a signal, we have this area of the signal plus noise distribution where a signal is present. So in this entire curve here, the signal is present. And in this case, it gives us evidence above criterion, and we say, yes, signal is there. And that is known as a hit. But then notice that we have that section of the signal plus noise distribution that falls below that criterion, and that is known as a miss. So in this case, a hit, for the example with the teacher, would be the hand is up, and the student is saying, oh, and the teacher says, yes, Susan, you have something to say? And the Susan's like, yes, I do. Thank you so much for calling, Mommy. I want to say this thing. That's a hit. A miss would be a student that has their hand up and the teacher doesn't notice that they have their hand up. Maybe this is the really shy student that only lifts it, a little bit. Not a lot of evidence, falls below criterion. The signal is there, but it just doesn't create enough evidence to get past that criterion. So those are the 4 different possibilities in any signal detection paradigm. And once you know those 4, once you know how many correct rejections there are, how many false alarms there are, how many misses there are, and how many hits there are, you can determine with some complicated math that we're not going to need to know, but just know that it specifically determines where those distributions are. So once you know that, you can measure the sensitivity. And the sensitivity is one of the biggest important things in terms of how successful you are at detecting or indicating that there isn't a signal, how accurate you are at doing that particular task. Because you can see here in this example, we have low sensitivity because those 2 peaks of these 2 curves, they're very close together. And look at how much red there is in this curve, in these 2 curves. We have a lot of misses. We got a lot of false alarms because those 2 curves are very, very close together. But what if the sensitivity increases? What if somebody becomes better at recognizing if a hand is up? What if somebody's hearing improves? Well, that is represented by the sensitivity increasing, which means that that distance between the 2 peaks gets bigger. And if that gets bigger, notice what happened to all the red. It went down. It went way down. So now we're getting far fewer misses. We still have the same number of false alarms, but we got a lot less red. So you are a lot more accurate when you're highly sensitive, which is exactly what we would expect. All right, so, oh yeah, that was the last thing I wanted to say. And then the last kind of piece to this puzzle that makes it incredibly important in terms of measuring sensitivity is that that criterion line does not matter where it is. You can still determine a person's sensitivity As long as you have some correct rejections, some false alarms, some misses, and some hits, you can tell where a person's criteria is. So it does make you do need, it does make a little bit of a difference where it is, because you can't just say yes to everything as we did in our example and measure sensitivity. That's where the process actually fails. But as long as you have some correct rejections, some hits, some misses, and some false alarms, you can tell exactly where something is. So for example, if this is a situation that the teacher was in and she thought to herself, you know what? A lot of students in my class, they're complaining that they're not getting called on. And this is causing issues, right? They're kind of shutting down. They're not participating. They're not engaged with the material. So I want to make sure that I call on students who have their hands up. That is my new goal. But I'm not going to get any better at actually identifying hands being raised. I mean, at my perceptual limit right now. But what can I do in this case? Well, what you can do, if the sensitivity is not going to increase, she can change her criterion. And she can say, you know what? I want to prioritize hits and minimize misses. So I'm going to move my criterion to the left. I'm going to adopt a more liberal criterion. So what she does is she says, you know what? My criterion used to be there. I'm going to move it over here. Notice that the distance between the peaks has not changed. So sensitivity has not increased at all. But also notice that we used to have a lot of misses, but now we have very few misses, right? That area of the curve has shrunk. But what area of the curve has increased? False alarms. So she was able to decrease the misses, but now she has a lot more false alarms. So the misses were the students that had their hands up, they had their hands raised, but they weren't getting called on. Who are the false alarms? What are those students? Yep. And getting called on. So the false alarms are the students that didn't raise their hands, but they are getting called on. So she was not able to increase her sensitivity, but she was able to make a decision about what amount of evidence she's going to require to call on somebody. And a unavoidable result of that is that when the misses goes down, now a student that has their hand up just a little bit, they're not going to get missed, right? Now they're going to get called on. But now many of the students who are just moving around, who are just kind of stretching, who are just maybe fidgeting in the seats, don't want to get called on. Now they're going to get called on. And one of the things that we're going to focus on next time that we meet is applying this type of scenario and this type of analysis to real world scenarios and the implications of that and what it can reveal to us about human behavior. So I keep doing this every single class. I'm just going to call it a feature now. I will leave you with this particular setup, and then we'll take a look at a few more real world examples. But something that's going to be very important to a lot of you coming up within the next couple of years is going to be applications to grad school. And applications to grad school can be thought of as a signal detection problem, because you basically have, for any grad school, you basically have two choices. Do I apply to this grad school or do I not apply to this grad school? So what I would like you to think of for next time, and then we'll take a look at what we come up with, is what is the evidence that yes, you should submit an application, right? What is the evidence that you could actually find that says submitting an application to this school and I will be accepted, right? And then what is the noise that is involved in submitting applications? And then also try to map on what are the hits in this scenario? What are the false alarms? What are the misses? What are the correct rejections? Because in any signal detection paradigm, in any yes or no decision, there are 4 possibilities. So in grad school, You can apply to someplace and you get in. You can apply to someplace and you get rejected. You can not apply to someplace and you are never going to get into that school, or you can not apply to someplace and you would have been accepted to that school. 4 possibilities. Try to think of where do they map onto this scenario, and then just to kind of extend that a little bit further, also think about what is the cost of being wrong in these scenarios and what is the benefit of being right in these scenarios. So I'll give you one cost just off the bat. A lot of grad schools require a fee in order to apply to them. So the idea of applying to every grad school out there that you could possibly want to go to sometimes is just not financially doable. So that would be one of the costs, for example, in one of the scenarios, but not one of the costs in the other scenarios. I don't want to say too much, but we will leave it as an exercise. So think about that. Think about where the signal detection paradigm would fall into the idea of, do I apply to a grad school or do I not apply to a grad school? And we will take a look at that next time we meet. So kind of think about which one of those is the false alarm correct rejection and what is the cost of those decisions. But other than that, unless there's any other final questions, all right, we are good to go.